Hello, my name is Kevin Probst, and welcome to Kevin's Corner. On this day, the 20th day of December in 2024, and I want to contemplate on a question that I've been thinking about lately. Can red America and blue America reconcile? Americans are extremely polarized on so many issues. We ride on opposite sides of the fence. Our opinions are on religion and politics, gender, morality, abortion, immigration seem irreconcilable. We tend to put all of these issues under a political umbrella, and we divide ourselves by identifying as being either red or blue. And those who identify as red are generally against open immigration and abortion. They're against redefining traditional marriage, and they're against woke culture. And those who identify as being blue are generally in favor of abortion. They consider it a woman's right. They favor gay marriage and sanctuary cities as places of refuge for illegal immigrants. And they favor DEI, diversity, equality, inclusion, which coincides with the woke society philosophy that they embrace. Thinking about these things, recently I had memories of my ancestors who were mostly farmers from Pennsylvania. My father grew up on a dairy farm and shared stories with us about baling hay and milking cows and cleaning out stalls and tending the garden. And although I did not grow up on a farm, I was very familiar with farm life. I had several uncles who lived on farms, and most all of that generation lived in a rhythm that only farm life can provide. In the winters, they made sure that the livestock were well fed and protected from the brutal winds that came off of the Great Lakes. They worked on maintaining and repairing machinery. In the spring, it was a time for crop rotation, for planting and fertilizing and irrigating. And then as summer rolled in, it was a time for cutting, baling, and storing forage for winter consumption. Crops were sprayed, and the summer harvest was canned and placed on shelves in the basement to be eaten in the winter months. Fruit and vegetables were carried to the farmers market for sale to those living in the urban areas. And during the fall, as the days grew shorter and temperatures began to drop, farmers would plant cover crops to avoid erosion and collect fallen leaves and corn stalks for mulch and spread manure and plan for the planting of new crops in the coming spring. I found that rhythm of rural life comforting. Certain things were always done at certain times, and if the routine was honored, life could be very predictable and expected outcomes varied little. I guess there was a certain farmer's law that they lived by. If you do well, and if you do it when you're supposed to do it, you'll reap great benefits from your diligence and from your hard labor. Many find comfort in the rhythms of rural life, and we should not underestimate or diminish the importance of things learned in a barn or out on the farm. Like floating along with the river current, there was a smooth and comfortable flow with all that was natural. The farmers' children watched as cows and sheep and goats, and chickens and horses and other farm animals yielded to the laws of nature. They watched the cows breed. They watched the birth of a calf. They watched the calf suckle from its mother's teat. They watched the young calves run playfully into pastures until they became full-grown adults, and then they watched the whole process repeat itself. It was all so natural and so normal, and no one questioned the Creator's genius when he formed such a system for reproducing and sustaining all life forms. And those who grew up on the farm are not so easily convinced of absurdities that are taught and accepted in our modern culture. They roll their eyes when men pretend to be women, and when they hear claims that a man can actually have and nurse a baby, They learn the foolishness of such insanities by observing the reproductive process over and over again in nature and out on the farm. The Apostle Paul explained to the Romans how they might more deeply and intimately know God by simply observing and submitting to the rhythms of his creation. This is what he said in Romans 12:20. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. America experienced a great migration toward urban areas as it grew older. During colonial times, 90% of our population were farmers. And then by the early 1900s, that percentage had dipped to about 40. And now, in our present age, only about 2% of Americans live on farms. Although church attendance is not necessarily an indicator of religiosity or of spirituality, church attendance among those living in rural areas generally exceeds church attendance of those who live in urban areas. This movement toward urban areas resulted in social atomism. That is the tendency for society to be made up of a collection of self-interested and largely self-sufficient individuals operating as separate atoms. This social theory suggests that many people enter urban society to promote their own self-interest. Climbing the corporate ladder to success is not so much a joint communal effort, it is rather an isolated, intense competition, a demonstration of Darwinian survival of the fittest. And building families is secondary to building careers. Atomism is a special social concept totally foreign to the rural Amish communities, who often join together for a barn raising when their neighbor's barn has been destroyed by fire or wind. I live in the state of Georgia, and our state is politically bifurcated. There are two separate Georgias. One is a very blue, very liberal, democratic area concentrated primarily in the urban areas of Georgia, Atlanta, Columbus, Savannah, Augusta. The rural areas of Georgia are very red, very conservative, and seem to gladly live up to what elitist Barack Obama once described as rural Americans who are Bible-toting and gun-clinging people. The red and the blue map indicates clearly that rural Americans have more conservative and more traditional, perhaps more scriptural values than those who populate urban areas. Many become less conscious of the natural laws authored by God for the benefit of all of mankind. And as secularism saturates the social fabric of urban areas, more and more become totally ignorant of God's plan for his creation. Let me throw in a caveat here. I don't mean to stereotype all urban dwellers as being liberal and secular and perhaps even godless. I would avoid such a broad bias because I know some wonderful, deeply committed, godly people who dwell in urban areas. I refer only to general trends in urban and rural areas. The farmer's children grew up on the farm and learned conservative values and received spiritual guidance from the older members of the family. And then off to college they go to earn their degrees and blaze their own path in life. And behavioral norms that they were taught are set aside often as they are forced to give up the predictable routine and security offered by the rural family social unit. They drift away from their social family unit and become individualized. And confusion follows because the behavior that's encouraged by their urban peers so often contradicts the behaviors accepted and taught in the rural communities in which they grew up. The society they live in seems chaotic compared to rural life on the farm. They are indoctrinated by secularism, which contributes to moral confusion. and they become disconnected from the foundational teachings that anchored them in their younger years. And their mental and spiritual confusion often leads to a feeling of loneliness, which has now been declared an epidemic in America. In May of 2023, the U.S. Surgeon General, Dr. Murthy, declared loneliness to be an epidemic that affects nearly 50% of Americans. Murthy said this, quote, "We're wired as human beings to connect with others. Our brains are designed for social connectedness. Our survival from birth to adulthood depends on it." End quote. The Surgeon General reported that loneliness or social isolation increases the risk of premature death. He said 29%. It's equivalent to the impact of smoking 15 cigarettes per day. Loneliness increases the risk of heart disease and stroke and dementia, according to Dr. Murthy. This epidemic certainly affects rural as well as urban areas. It should be noted that being alone is not an indicator of loneliness. Being alone can often contribute positively to our mental and emotional, spiritual health. Following a divorce in 1999, I decided to flee to Atlanta, seeking a new start in life. I taught at Duluth High School, and I found an apartment in Alpharetta. I learned that more is not always better. I lived in Metro Atlanta community of over 4 million people, and I felt like I was probably the most lonely person in all of Atlanta. The large populations of urban areas offer anonymity, which can serve as a cover for immoral activity. You may never again see those people you partied with last night. Immoral activity certainly happens in rural areas as well, undeniably. But man's heart remains sinful regardless of where he chooses to dwell. However, hiding sinful behavior from caring neighbors and loved ones seems much easier in urban communities. The same trend toward secularism and liberalism and loneliness in urban areas is also evident in our universities. Harvard, our earliest university, was established in 1636 for the sole purpose of preparing young men for the ministry as were subsequent Ivy League schools. Nearly 400 years later, in August of 2021, Harvard unanimously elected an atheist, Greg Epstein, to be the president of the Organization of Chaplains. While the blue states become bluer and the red states redder, the question remains, how did we become so polarized? And how might we set aside our vast differences and narrow the gaping chasm that separates us? There is but one who can bridge the divide between red and blue. He bridged the gap between he and the woman at the well. He bridged the divide between the Jews and the Gentiles. He bridged the divide between his own holiness and the sinfulness of mankind. The vast differences between the red and the blue evaporate when they become one with the Father and experience perfect unity in Christ Jesus. The Apostle Paul reminds us in Galatians 3:28, there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is no male or female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. We might add that there is neither red nor blue when we find unity in Christ Jesus. I hope you found this helpful. If so, please hit the like button. And I would love for you to subscribe to Kevin's Corner for more material like this. And if this was helpful to you, please share it with someone else. And thank you for your time. Goodbye.